Only 6 years later, the Watchtower Society would refer to Greber not as a spiritist or an occultist, but as a biblical scholar. For you see, it was first in Greber's translation of the New Testament that John 1:1 was written as the Word was a God. Just as the idea that Jesus Christ was Michael the Archangel originated with one woman going into spiritistic trances, the translation that the Word was a God had its origins with a biblical translation by a man who the Watchtower Society itself had specified that it knew was an occultist and a spiritist. Both the Archangel Michael theory and the translation the Word was a God came directly from visions seen by spirit mediums. In 1962, the Watchtower Society released a booklet called The Word, Who Is He, According to John. They quote Greber's translation of John 1:1. A footnote explains, "The New Testament, a new translation and explanation, based on the oldest manuscripts by Johannes Greber, edition of 1937, the front of this bound translation being stamped with a golden cross." They were referring to the exact same version with the golden cross that they had earlier condemned as being created by spirits. The Watchtower Society continued to quote Greber. He was also quoted, for example, in the September 15th issue of Watchtower of 1962 on page 554. He's also quoted in the 1965 edition of the Make Sure book, page 489. In their 1971 book, Aid to Bible Understanding, he's quoted on page 1134 and then again at 1669. Then he was quoted again in the Watchtower issues of the 15th of October 1975, page 640, and April 15th, 1976, page 231. Eventually, however, their use of Johannes Greber's quotes and translations began to have a negative impact as the public found out who he was. In typical Watchtower fashion, they did what they always do. They lied. In a letter dated the 20th of December 1980, the Watchtower Society sent a letter to the Johannes Greber Memorial Foundation, thanking them for sending them copies of his translation. Apparently the foundation found out that the Watchtower Society had been quoting his books favorably and felt that they might like a copy of them. Of course, in sending a thank you letter, it was shown that they knew where this foundation was and where to acquire copies of this translation as well as Greber's other books, such as Communication with the Spirit World of God. The next year, in 1981, Keith Morse of the Personal Freedom Outreach wrote to the Watchtower Society asking where he could get a copy of this book. The Society wrote back, "In line with your comments on the title page of our library copy of this book, against the date 1937, the publishers are given as John Felsberg, Inc., 88 North 4th Avenue, New York, New York. This is really the only information that we have." The Society was lying. This was not the only information that they had, because they had sent a thank you letter to the newer address of the Society. They deliberately sent out an old address from 1937 and claimed that they didn't have any other information about where a copy of the book could be acquired, despite the fact that just a year before they had sent a thank you letter to the Johannes Greber Memorial Foundation, who had provided them with a copy of the book. In fact, they had received a copy of both the New Testament translation as well as the book Communication with the Spirit World of God. In a letter dated September 27, 1982, M. Kurt Goedelman of the same organization, that is, the Personal Freedom Outreach, sent another letter to the Watchtower Society asking why they cite Greber's work when they're aware that he's a spirit medium. He included in this letter various evidences of Johannes Greber being a medium and an occultist. The Watchtower Society declined to respond. On the other hand, when a concerned Jehovah's Witness wrote, asking them about their use of the medium's translations and beliefs. The Society wrote back in a letter dated March 15, 1983, "It was not our concern to go into the background or religious convictions of each translator. Who really can say if Mr. Greber was under the influence of the demons when translating a particular verse or portion of his translation? If he was under demon influence in translating John 1:1, then it is not beyond the devil or his demons to tell the truth on occasions, if doing so will advance their evil ends in some way, such as giving opposers some excuse for claiming that the translation published by Jehovah's Witnesses must not be correct because it happens to translate John 1:1 in a similar manner to the way the translation in question does." So while teaching that it's wrong to be involved in spiritism or to get answers from spirits, they say that it's not their concern to go into the background or religious convictions of a translator. Then they say, how do we know that he just happened to be under the influence when translating John 1:1? Maybe the demons had nothing to do with that particular verse. Then their final desperate plea comes through with, well, perhaps the devil or his demons knew that we would find the real translation 50 years later and use it, and so he gave the true translation to this medium so that it would make us look bad. The letter also ends with them acknowledging that they did in fact receive a copy of Greber's New Testament translation from the Johannes Greber Memorial Society. Their earlier statement, then, that they didn't know where to get a copy of this was again proven to be a lie. Finally, they did what they always do when all of their other excuses completely fail. They simply denied that they knew any better. Under questions from readers in the April 1st edition, 1983, which was only a couple of months after that last letter was received, clearly they saw this becoming a problem, they said, as indicated in the foreword to the 1980 edition of the New Testament by Johannes Greber, this translation relied on God's spirit world to clarify for him how he should translate difficult passages. It is stated, his wife, a medium of God's spirit world, was often instrumental in conveying the correct answers from God's messengers to Pastor Greber. The Watchtower has deemed it improper to make use of a translation that has such a close rapport with Spiritism. Improper to make use of a translation that has such a close rapport with Spiritism? Only a few months earlier it was not their concern to go into the background or religious convictions of each translator. A few months earlier they simply didn't think it was important. Now they find it very important and don't want to use it now that they know the truth, but they didn't know before. Which one is it? Is it simply unimportant that he was a medium? They simply didn't know? It can't be both. The second explanation, of course, is also a lie, because as shown earlier on, back in 1956, they said very plainly in more than one of their own publications that he was a spirit medium and that they believed that he used the spirits to translate his Bible. Then a few short years later, he went from being a spirit medium and occultist to being a much-needed biblical scholar. Then suddenly he was a medium, but it really didn't matter. It wasn't important, and it wasn't their place to go into his background. Besides, the whole thing could have just been cooked up by the devil in order to make them look bad. But none of that was important, because the real truth was they had no idea at all. There's much more information you can find on all of this. But as you can see, the idea that Jesus Christ was Michael the Archangel had its origins in people falling into trances and being given visions, and then was later supported by a biblical translation that was created by a spirit medium who received his information through trances and visions. And then both of these religions had their origins in a religion that had false prophecies, and both of which wrote off these false prophecies as simply being misunderstood new ages leading to the end, or invisible comings of Christ each time. As you can see, there's no doubt that these ideas had their origins in and have been continually perpetuated by occultism and communication with the spirit world.